So I guess David just wanted to thank you also for proposing the interview and for agreeing to interview. I mean, I've been wanting to talk to you about a lot of your work for some time, so this is a really great opportunity to kind of have something a little more official and recorded and permanent. So thank you.
It's also something good to, fall back on maybe, so.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess today we're going to be talking about one of your more recent series, At the Gates. Yeah. And so I think before we start, could you give me a sort of approximate date range for when you started this series and when it concluded in your mind?
Well, it's not concluded, and it came together actually, it coincided with my change of media. So before that, I worked exclusively with oils, and I started working. First, I did a pretty large amount of drawings, acrylics, pigments on paper, and so that took I did not paint at all for more than 6 months in 2018. It started in 2018 in the middle of the year. And by then I was just doing drawings. I mean, I call them drawings, they're not really drawings. I work on paper. They're basically paintings, but they're on paper. So and then I realized that I might be able to do the same also on a canvas. And then started working on canvas with the same media. So I make my own acrylic paints as much as I used to make my own oil paints with pigments and now acrylics as medium. And it just freed me up quite a bit because I do not deal with this huge loads of material anymore. So yeah, it was good.
Well, I will ask you more about the materials shortly, but yeah.
Yeah, and the series is still going on. I mean, I packed like a lot of different themes and different motives underneath this umbrella of calling it At the Gates, because it's basically about standing at the threshold of something else, of something new, of something unknown, more or less, which is like what we do every day. If you get up in the morning, you're standing at the threshold of something unknown, which is the day you are entering. So that is the background of the whole series.
That's great. Well, so just to sort of piggyback on that comment, so I mean, based on your writings about the series and your conversation just now, I mean, this series is kind of about those liminal states, the space of transition from one point to another. So what specifically was sort of the trigger for making this series? What brought you to explore this kind of in-between state that we all experience on a day-to-day basis, and particularly now, we're all in a liminal state at this exact moment. But for you, when you started this?
I would say it was a thought process, which like it was. I cannot really identify any particular trigger for it, but it had certainly also to do with the idea of these mass movements from people, like a very like an outer reality, so to speak, of these mass movements of people from one country to another. The idea to, this mass migration we are hearing about in Europe and so on. So that was one outer kind of motivation, but it's not really about that. So it was like kind of the idea that, and it also has to do a little bit with the idea of stranger, like being a stranger or, entering into some community or whatever, some new, some new country, some new city, whatever, you're moving and you're entering something new, and, there is a dynamic happening there. So, and so that is also part of it, part of what this is about. But I wouldn't say, I can't really point my finger and say this is like, this was the trigger and this is, but this is, it's more ambivalent. There's a larger context.
Oh, for sure. And I think the thing that's really interesting about this series is the fact that it is open to a good amount of interpretation about what those gates are, what that transition is. I think there's so much in life that is both specifically related to current events, but there's also so much that is just about the human experience of how you transition from one space to another. So it leaves itself open to the variety of interpretations. Now, one thing that I found very interesting when thinking about this series is the fact that, we have two very prominent metaphors for when we think about passageways. When you think about gates specifically, we're talking about, to a certain degree, there's a bit of a negative connotation, something that is barring you from something else, something that is a barrier, something that, you are on the outside and then you need to get in, but it's a bit of it's a negative experience, something that is keeping you from your progress. On the other hand, you have the door metaphor, right? So you have a passageway that is positive. You open the door to something that is, a door is open for you and you go in and it's this, this amazing, wonderful, positive experience. So in your mind, where does this series fall in terms of categorizing this passage? Are we at a gate? Is this something that is keeping you or from moving forward, or are we at a door? Is this an opportunity, or is it a hybrid of both?
I would say the gate, the connotation of something called a gate is a manifestation of the borderline between one state and another state. And without that gate, the gate provides access to that other state, but you have to go through it. So meaning like you have to, let's say when we're talking about science or whatever, you have to have a certain amount of knowledge in order to enter the next state. So that makes, there are gatekeepers. There are gatekeepers who are standing there and don't let you in if you don't have the qualification to go in. And it doesn't make any sense for you to be in that state because you don't know what's happening there. So there's this famous story about four rabbis, like very distinct personalities, Rabbi Akiva and three others. I don't recall the names right now, but they were entering the Garden of Eden, so to speak, through meditation, and they came out changed. Only one, Rabbi Akiva, came out unchanged. One became insane. One lost his faith, and I don't know exactly what happened to the third one, but they were all changed by the experience because they were not prepared to be there. They wanted to be there to change something in that realm, but they couldn't. So, and only one was able to go in and come out in the same way because he was prepared. So, and that is to me, it's a metaphor for what this really means, a gate. To go through into a different state, whether it's a state of mind or it's a state of whatever acquired knowledge or whatever it is, or maybe it's just a physical space. But there's always that barrier, and I don't think it's negative, or I don't think it has any negative connotation. It's just a fact of life. It's like a fact of reality. So and you need to. A lot of people do not accept this mechanics these days because they're saying, I need to have access to everything. But and that's a good idea maybe, but you will not have access to everything because you're not prepared. You don't have the knowledge. You don't have whatever the right state of mind, or maybe you don't have the passport, whatever it is. So that's basically what my in short, what I think about gates or the idea of gates.
So the figures who we're seeing in this series then, they're potentially a mixture of individuals who want to approach this transition point, which is, there is a struggle involved in some way. It's something where if you pass through it, if you get whatever that, whether it's a metaphor for a psychological or intellectual different plane of understanding, or whether it's a physical barrier, in one way or another, there is a bit of a struggle to get there, and we don't know as viewers whether or not this group or these groups that are approaching have the tools. There's an uncertainty about approaching this gate and not knowing whether or not you have those tools. You're going to end up on the other side enlightened, or you're going to be forever changed by not being prepared. Would that be an accurate? Okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, this, otherwise it would be more or less a preconceived concept, so which I'm not working like that. So I'm working fluidly. So I don't have any idea whether this is going to be it or it's not going to be it. I'm working on it, and then suddenly it pops out and it's clear and has to stay like that. And there's I don't think maybe it's a thought process. I'm not even sure whether it's a thought process. It's like somehow you feel you have reached a state in a painting where you have accomplished all you could at this point, and it says something which rings in you, rings a bell in yourself, and then you leave it alone. So that's how this develops. There's never the idea, oh, I'm going to do this now, and these people shall say that. I find my titles after I paint. So it's like, it's not like I have a title and then I paint it.
Yeah, it's a good order of things, I think. So then, with that kind of in mind, one thing that I've been wondering is sort of what position does it place the viewer in? So if we are encountering these figures at a moment of transition, at a moment of transition which may or may not be successful, where are we? Are we on the other side of the gate? Are we with them? Are we part of their transition, or are we sort of looking beyond? We're saying we've already made it, or where are we? Are we on their journey, or are we kind of on the other side? Are they trying to get to us?
I don't, I think, I mean, to me, it's like we are not involved. We are observing the situation, observing what's happening. I am observing what's happening. So I'm neither on their side nor am I on the other side. If I could, I would probably paint this from above, So having figures looked at from the bird's eye view, that might be an interesting thing to do. But that is basically how I look at this. I'm not on either side. So it's like looking at what is, or what happened, what is happening.
So you're a witness. So you and the viewer, as sort of a surrogate for your perspective, would be a witness to these transitions that are happening in all of their flavors and all of the different successes or failures of this group. That's very interesting. So the other thing that you had brought up just a few minutes ago, the idea of a gatekeeper, because with any of these transitions, you have this implicit third party, someone who is controlling the gate or the door or the passageway. Someone needs to open it. Someone needs to let you in. Do you have a sense of if there is, how do you view this gatekeeper? Who is it? Is this a specific person? Is this a spiritual embodiment in some way? Who is that third party who's responsible for facilitating the transition point?
That's hard to answer. I mean, I think the gatekeeper always needs to be needs to express what's behind that gate. So he needs to be the expression, the manifestation of what is behind that gate in order to be able to control the access. So he has to have that ethical, moral, or scientific knowledge, or anything what rules the other side. That has to be his or hers mode of operation. So clearly, I mean, and of course, but also neutral in a certain sense, because just more or less just I would say objectively ruling the access.
So it's a sort of an omnipresent ideal in some sense, someone who has achieved or is the embodiment of whatever it takes to be able to have the tools to make that passage and to get through to the other side. Someone who is, or something, or an entity in some way that has realized whatever those individuals who are approaching the gate are seeking, to sort of be the one to judge. To a certain degree, there's a judgment aspect. Have you, have you met the criteria? Are you ready? So it's interesting because it creates a degree of uncertainty that kind of lies behind a lot of the images.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's a little bit like Kafka's the Schloss, the castle.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to gain access,
mm-hmm.
and there's a gatekeeper, and he finds out only later this is the gate that was only made for him. Mm-hmm. So, and the story goes on and on and on. He comes every day, he wants to get in, and he can't get in, and now. And in the end, he finds out there are no other people who are going through this gate. This gate was made for him, and he had to qualify to get through it. So that's a little bit, I mean, I'm sure this is like in the back of my mind somehow, doing these things. So it has to do with it, sure.
Is there, along those lines, I mean, is there a work in the series, which I may not have up on the screen or on my PowerPoint, but is there a work that you feel is particularly personal that represents sort of a struggle that you have gone through, or your own transition, that it's your Kafka gate, like your personal best example?
No, I don't think there's any particular one where I would say this is like my own experience. They're all, to a certain extent, my own experiences, mm-hmm. because this is like when you want to achieve something, you're always at this gate.
Right.
That's also a story of painting, if you want. Yeah. I mean, once the idea to look at in sports, like somebody who jumps a certain distance and sets a world record with this. That doesn't mean, yes, he has that world record, but it doesn't mean he jumps the same amount the next time he's jumping. So he, again, has to prepare everything in the right way in order to jump that distance. And that's the same when you play music. It's the same when you paint a painting, because the fact that you achieved this and this looks so fantastic, and it doesn't mean you achieve it again. Yeah. And a lot of people are helping themselves by developing methods and by developing like strategies, and to a certain extent, I think that's legitimate. But on the other hand, I don't think it is really, because you need to jump in with everything you have. I mean, in terms of painting, sure. I mean, I don't know what the preparation for an athletes are, but in painting, I think strategies okay, but methods and a certain set of rules are preventing you from actually making great paintings. So it's like way better to don't have. There are certain baselines, but better to have no rules.
There's a faith component, the idea that you're going to sort of jump in with everything that you have and there's the faith in the uncertainty. You don't know if it is going to land,
and
but
that
the
is,
faith that sometime it will.
yeah, and that is what really makes it interesting. I mean, you know, that makes it worthwhile to jump in there too, because it's always I felt that, you know, when I was way younger, I felt that more existential, you know, like it was kind of fighting for my life there, you know, like, can I take myself seriously or not? So, so that has leveled a little bit, but it's still that kind of energy which is there, and you start painting.
It is interesting because that what your description of the process of painting, with the hope that you will achieve something that is success at the conclusion of it, with the unknown and the uncertainties, it could flop, it could succeed, is sort of a parallel structure to how you're describing the gates in general, how they function, how they work. The idea that you may or may not be prepared. You're not going to know until you arrive, and then you challenge the gatekeeper whether or not you're able to sort of move through. So there's an interesting parallel between your process and how you're describing this passage that's embodied in these works.
Yeah, it's a little bit self-referential. So,
but it's a good thing. I mean, I think so. It actually segs quite nicely with sort of my next series of questions about process, because one thing that I really love about this series is the fact that the figures are so amorphous. There's a very clear energy that you can describe each work, less necessarily by the figures and more by the feeling that emerges through the figures. The energy, the tone of the work comes through more so than being able to say something very clear about the figures. There's something very powerful about that. There's somewhere between inhuman and human. They kind of go back and forth. They're sort of figures in a dream, but they're also, figures that every once in a while you'll see, as you can see here, a very clear face and expression, something where it brings you to the humanity that is inherent to this series. And I think that type of ambiguity, right, I think is, and also openness to interpretation, I think is similar in a certain sense to the multiple ways you can view this passage, whether it is a direct analogy for your process of how you view art making, or it is something more metaphysical in terms of whether or not you have achieved a certain level or a certain degree of enlightenment. So I find that a very interesting way that your process and the materials kind of work together to create this space, this ambiguous space that leaves open a good amount of interpretation. But for you, I mean, how do you view your process and the physicality of these works, which are very tactile? I mean, for me, one of the things that strikes me, even seeing them as an image file as opposed to necessarily in person, and when I've seen some of them in person, there is a tactility that really comes off the screen as well as in person. These are very physical works. You sort of feel your making in the process of kind of experiencing them. And there's an energy and a rush and an urgency that sort of characterizes all of them. So I was wondering if you could speak sort of first to how you feel not only your process, but also the materials, and how does that reflect or in your mind serve the narrative of transition that you have for this series?
Yeah, I mean, the material it's all very fluid. I mean, like unlike the paintings I made, I used to make in with this thick oil, which also, I mean, it's also fluid, but it's masses. It's like massive, masses you have to move around. So it's like kind of heavy, somehow physically heavy. So, and what's so enticing for me with this material, with this acrylics, is that you can move so freely and so quickly. And there is and with painting, it's in general, I would say it's always, you know, it's like Schröder's cat, you know, it's like where there is the possibility. There are unknown numbers of possibilities, of manifestations in there. And you just have to watch that, and then you have to grab it, and you have to hold on to that manifestation you just see, and then you work a little further on it to keep it and make it clearer. But if you do that too much, the whole thing falls apart, and you have a shitty drawing, shitty painting, which does not have that energy anymore, because you just painted it to death. And that is always a very real possibility. And and to work it to that point when this finally, you know, like kind of takes on a certain gestalt, you know, takes on a certain form, and you have to really step back and, you know, leave it alone. So and that is sometimes, it's a difficult process actually, but I think the space, that's, you know, another thing which I've been working on for 40 years for sure, the fascination with 3 dimensions and the idea to bring space on a flat surface. And I think painting in general is about space. Even the most abstract painters were dealing with space. And you look at Jackson Pollock, there's so much space in there that you get. And, you know, yes, there is a flatness maybe, but, you know, but there's also space. Yes. And I think that's the main theme of painting, actually, to see something in space and to have a relationship of space and figure, or space and object.
But it's interesting to bring up, you know, Jackson Pollock. So with Pollock's work, and then also with your work and your process, there is definitely a building up of the surface. And by your description, this idea that you work the painting until it feels like you've reached that point. The subject emerges in the way that you feel like it emerges. There's the risk of excess, where you've built it up too much, you've overdone it, right? But then there's a point in which you've created a sort of new world within a very confined space that is just enough. And it's a very different way of thinking about painting than the sort of maintaining that 2-dimensional illusion of a surface. So consistent with someone like Pollock, consistent with your work, and also in many ways, it's the sort of consistent, but on the inverse side, to sort of how a sculptor works, right? The idea that with a sculptor, the narrative is always, right, within that stone, within the marble is the work, but you have to chip away at it. And in your case, it's, well, the work you have to build up to get to that essence, right? With a sculpture, you go one chip too far and you've destroyed the work that's there. With a sort of tactile painting in the model that you're working in, and in the model of other tactile painters who sort of work in that space between 2 and 3 dimensions, it is that you have to find it by building it up, but then what happens when you go just a little step too far, right? Then it's done. So it's very interesting to think about that connection, and also that analogy with Pollock, because it does seem, looking at your works, again, even it comes through very clearly even in an image file, right? That this is a surface that is built up, that the figures emerge through a multi-layered surface. It's not, you never get the sense that, you know, I keep coming back to figures like this one, where you never get the sense where this is a figure that was predetermined in your own head. You get the sense that, you know, the forms were built up, and it's layer upon layer of color and texture, and suddenly that individual child and that expression just emerged. It's a natural process. It's an organic process. That's the sense that sort of comes across. And so you mentioned this as a slightly different way of working than in previous series, largely because of the material and the freedom and the fluidity that you get from this material. Is that?
On paper, I have always, for a long time, I worked with acrylics and pigments, but it was never, I was not so pronounced, and it was always like, it was not really on such a large scale of series, so where I have made at least 120, 150 drawings like this. I mean, large ones. I mean, like 40 by 30 or something like that. So relatively large drawings, and they're just, you know, kept on coming, and so that might be different than to, you know, like compared to other things I've done before, but the behavior is good.
The behavior is consistent. It's just the medium allows you to express it a little differently.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, you know, the difference between, you know, me and Pollock, for example, or others who are working just plain gestures which have no comparison in reality or in the real world, is that at a certain point, and I think Pollock felt that also, it becomes, you can make 100,000 of those, you know, you can just go on and go on and go on, but you lose that excitement, you lose that build-up moment, the moment when you understand, when you find, suddenly you see, there is that manifestation of something, and you want to keep that. So, and you lose that when you make this tons and tons of these things, and particularly if there is no reference anymore. Mm-hmm. So, you know, for Pollock, there wasn't any. I mean, he was a figurative painter at one point in his life, but and when in the last paintings he made, where he might have realized that he needs to somehow anchor himself into something where you have that tension, you know, like built in. So yeah, so to me, this is, I mean, there has never been a question that it has to be figurative. It has to be somehow, and always my whole interest is in figures and is in the human story and drama. So to me, that's very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can see it. I mean, I again, this figure has just sort of stuck with me, because you do have that in between something that, within the limitations of the definitions of abstract versus figuration, which is obviously a binary, which is in many ways has been proven for many years to be sort of a false binary, because abstract painters, many of them, or at least in the earlier years, they weren't thinking of themselves in that way. It was a means to reflect something within the real world. So there's an inherently figurative aspect, even if visually you don't have the suggestion of a figure. So the definition of the two can, I think, get very muddled and blurred. But that being said, the thing that I particularly appreciate, and specifically about this series, is that you have this very clear sort of back and forth between dealing with the sort of more abstract materiality of the paint, and then the forms that emerge as a consequence of the paint. It's like the potential that is there embedded within this series to sort of illustrate, well, what happens when you take these techniques and these materials to what could be considered their logical conclusion in the process of painting, where, you know, it's very clearly a built-up surface. It's very clearly dealing with sort of the material qualities of a thinner paint application that is sort of dripping, you know, appears to sort of be dripping off the canvas or off the work on paper. But what it does is, in the process of this illustration of process, it creates the contours of a figure. It creates the contours of an emotion. So it's kind of proving the falsehood of the binary that we've kind of lived with for a very long time in terms of art history, that something is either this or this. And
Yeah, I
it's,
always felt that. Yeah.
which I do appreciate quite a bit. So in terms of sort of the physicality of your process, I get the sense that you work very quickly. Is that accurate in terms of when you realize it's the right step to make, it's a quick move, or is it the illusion of rapidity, but it's every gesture, even though it is quickly applied, takes a while to get to the point where it's a gesture? Which way do you fall in terms of these works?
It's all quickly done, actually. The best, that's also what it's almost like an unconscious type of, making these marks and then, kind of looking at the whole and then discovering things when you look at it. So there's a lot of observation going on also, but the actual act of painting is really very quick. And I find it, if it's not that quick, I find at most of the time it doesn't work. So when I try to be clever or something like that, and most of the time it doesn't work. So it is not the most effective way of painting because it's like takes time, and sometimes it's also and it fails, so it's not the most effective way to make an image, but I do not want to make images anyway. So it's like more like a search process for myself, and it's not so much image making. But I have a goal to have arrive at a certain thing. That's never the case, actually. And I have to say, I was always fascinated with these people who made the big marks, like Shiraga, for example, the Japanese painter who paints with his feet. So he has a canvas, decked out on the floor, and then he uses oil paint, big oil paint, and he makes the marks. He's like the brush of God, so to speak. He makes this mark with the feet dangling from a rope from the ceiling. So, and there are fantastic, energetic, expressions of expressions. So I totally fascinated with that. So, but he's like the references are not there really. It's like not. It's completely, kind of like a Franz Klein abstract. So I don't know whether you know him.
Yeah. So it's
I mean Shiraga, not Franz Klein, but.
Well, there's a pure expressiveness. There's an element of chance.
Both
embracing. Right?
Yeah, it's Shiraga's work is both spiritual and very expressive. It's like a meditation, it's bound somewhere in this tradition, in the Japanese Zen Zen inking tradition. So, and that's what makes it so fascinating, because he's bound somewhere in the tradition, but he made something completely, combined it with something completely different, and made something completely different out of it. And I would like to look at myself in the same light, although I'm not doing something completely different, but I am bound by this tradition, by this Western, figurative tradition. I'm in there. So, and that you cannot take that out of me. It's like there. And so that's why, it has, it became this type of lifelong struggle, to work with these figures and make them, have them as unstable and as much of possibilities and manifest in different ways as possible. So that's that's probably it.
It makes sense. I mean, I think that to be able to sort of acknowledge the place where you come from, where your artistic sensibilities kind of born within this Western tradition, and particularly a Western figurative tradition, but to view it as iterative, where, you know, it's the root of it is still this value of representing a figure in some way or having a figure present, but it's the way in which you do that, and that's where the sort of variation and the sort of newness comes in. And what are the impetuses behind creating that figure, whether it's on the one hand something that's very studied, or in your case something that is more expressive of the moment, quick, in a very different sense than someone who is sort of plotting out on a grid where a figure is going to fall. So it's interesting to see that analogy with a Japanese artist who is coming at using, again, the roots of that tradition and that artistic legacy, but again, coming at it with the same impulse of an energetic, expressive, and sort of chance-based rapidity of making. So that's very interesting to sort of think about that parallel. The way the traditions kind of return, how you can't escape them. Right?
Yeah. No, the whole idea, I think I don't know, I do believe in you have to somehow, I always believe that for myself at least, you know, that somehow you have to come out of a tradition. You have to think about this tradition also, and because you are, and if you deny that for yourself, then, you know, it's like you're cutting off all these layers of hundreds of years of developing painting. So so it has to be in there. You cannot just go without knowledge of the figure, without knowledge of human bodies. You can't make these paintings. You need to have that knowledge. So in order to be able to forget it then, and you know, so forget it in so far that you're not constructing something, you know, so, but it appears. So that was always my goal, to have things just appear. It's like, if I could, I would just throw the paint at the painting and at the canvas, and it appears. So that would be fine with me. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good, and you know, it is the alternative to not recognizing, acknowledging, and embracing that every artist, or, you know, is a product of his or her own training, upbringing, context, historical legacy in terms of making, how you define art, right? To deny that is sort of it's a willful ignorance, and I think it's a big misstep in terms of the making process. You have to have that level of self-awareness about, it's not a question of limitations, it's a question of framework, because you need to, you innovate within a framework in a certain sense much better than if you pretend as if there is no framework. So, for sure. Well, the other thing I wanted to pivot a little bit, so along those lines, in terms of that sort of expressive mode of making, at least in terms of works that I know that I react to, one of the most effective and yet also challenging pieces of works, including like yours, is the fact that you have to, how can you use an economy of line, an economy of sort of color, and a sort of minimal level of sort of figurative reference, but yet still have a powerful emotional impact, right? That to me is the greatest challenge in terms of art making that is in the category of the work that you're doing. So dealing with this with only a few gestures, how can you have, say, the suggestion of a mother and child? In a few gestures, how can you, convey this sort of really deep emotion? And I got the sense throughout that there was this really wonderful way in which the energy that I was getting from the work, the sort of emotions that were coming through about this process of transition, a lot of the cause of that for me was a successful application of an economy of line. And the thing that kept the artist who kept coming back in my own head was Berkowitz, and this is just one example where, you know, she, you know, this is Brooks, 1924. This is from one of the, it's so propaganda, not propaganda, but it was one of the.
Yeah, she was bound in this whole socialist ideas. Yeah, sure.
But it's a similar impact when I see her work. When I think about economy of line, sort of the minimal amount that you need to sort of suggest for maximum emotional impact, you know, the curve of the body in such a way that you get that emotion through it. In the same way, you know, here, you know, I get in sort of this grouping here, this sense of hurriedness, of sort of protectiveness, of urgency, of, you know, all of these feelings, but they come from again, I keep coming back to that phrase, economy of line, right? The minimum amount you need, but yet it results in the maximum emotional impact. Is this anywhere in your thought process, this type of, you know, art making, this idea of the emotional impact of an economy of line, or is this, it just happens to be a consequence of what your natural process is?
It is both, I think. It's like, you know, I mean, these are real drawings. I mean, this is more, I mean, they are also done with, you know, spatulas and fluid ink and you know, some of them are done with graphite, which I solve in acrylic. So it's graphite powder basically, and drawing is the power of leaving things out. So, you know, like you can, with a drawing, one line has to define everything. So like the less lines you have, the more powerful a drawing is, because you need to give the eye of the observer the possibility to construct the entire figure. And you suggesting the figure, it's just there. With this few lines, you're suggesting something that's happening there. And I find also what is important to me, I mean, drawing is, in that sense, is a very important exercise. And what I find also quite important about that is that, which we haven't talked about at all yet, is that movement. You know, you have not only, you know, you can make a painting where everything is frozen. And I was never looking to have something like this. I wanted to always, at least the possibility of that they are moving, or they might move in the next moment, it might look different. So, and that is, I think, a very, very important aspect for my work. But also when you look at really successful paintings from the Renaissance or so, although they are forever stuck in that space and they are holding forever that child, but they look like they can get the next moment they might get up and walk away. So and there's a possibility of movement in there. So, and I want that as well, but I also want the movement itself. So I want them to move. When you look at them, they're moving. They need to move. So, and you can do this, I think, best with drawings. I mean, with a black and white drawing, with a drawing where you have fluid media, and you know, and use that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I see, it's interesting because when you talk about movement, I think, you know, the way when I was looking at this series, the movement to me, I was coding it in my own head as sort of an energy. It was an energy born from sort of the process and visualizing the process. But it's interesting because when you think about categorizations of line, right? So you have the process, the visualization of that process, where you clearly see the sort of rapidity with which you were putting this into place. But it's then, what is that line imbued with? Is it that nervous line? Is it that energetic line? Is it that agitated line? And in this case, it is that rapidly moving line. It is something that is hurried, that is rushed. So you have your process sort of embodied within that specific line, within the sort of sketches and the drawings within this series, which I find very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's also it's also a manifestation of the moment. You know, it's like it's all basically this one of those most fascinating things in life is to realize that you're living in one moment only.
Mm-hmm.
You're not living in 10 minutes. You're not living like 10 minutes ago. You're living only now. And those are, I mean, there's a certain convergence there for me. I was like very early already in my teens interested in Zen Buddhism and the idea of that, you know, and I have forgotten this along the way, you know, like you come back to it, you know, once in a while you meet somebody or you have a conversation or you fall back on, get back to a book you read 30 years ago and suddenly it pops into your head again. This is what it is. And the most successful lives can only be lived in the now. And you have to treat every aspect of the now with, you know, with care, with, you know, with your utmost attention. And when you do that, then you live, then you're really there. And that is maybe also one of the reasons why I could never give this up completely. I mean, I could never say, so now I have done everything, or I painted, and that's it. And it's a form of meditation, if you want, as well. So, and that is a very, it's a big aspect of, you know, how I view painting. So it reminds me, you know, that yes, you want to be in the now. You do not want to be tomorrow or next week or whatever. So, and I think that's a struggle we all live with, and even the greatest Zen masters and the greatest rabbis or whatever, they all struggle with that condition. It's like a universal condition we're having, because we have that mind, and which is fine to have a mind, but which is standing in the way of being in acting right now, being in the now, and being like completely filling out this space completely. So, and yeah, and that might be in there as well. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I think, I mean, I definitely think so, but I think that's interesting hearing sort of your description of this idea of capturing the present, of, you know, and there's it's an irony, but a bit of a paradox in the fact that you do get a sense of that urgency and that immediacy and that present moment. But as opposed to, say, something that is inherently more ephemeral, right? So like an action or, you know, a site-specific work that perhaps appears and disappears, that has a present that conforms to the evolution, to the progression of time. The thing with a painting is always that idea of permanence. So you're capturing permanently a present moment. So it's that tension, I think it's a very human tension, where you want to both be in the present and yet also capture it. You want to hold on to the moment. It's not just about living, it's not just about experiencing, it's about preserving it. And there's something very, I said, very, very human about that desire to kind of hold on, not only be in the present, but also preserve it, because we don't want it to.
Sure. Yeah.
So.
And what's also interesting in this idea is that I just lost my train of thought. I wanted to. Okay, it comes back to me.
It'll come back.
I know it will come back. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so separately from this, I mean, thinking about, I did keep coming back, thinking about, you know, other artistic models for a certain, that are in my own head became analogous to what I was seeing in your work. How do you feel about the connection or relationship between your work and sort of a figure like Kollwitz, who is much more...
A figure like who? Kollwitz?
A figure like Kollwitz, yeah. So, I mean, is that something that, does that feel right to you? Does that feel sort of off base? Do you not see yourself in that type of trajectory of working as a figurative artist?
I'm connected to so many different painters and like it's I wouldn't, like, to me, in a certain way, it's a I always viewed Kollwitz, for example, as somebody who had this incredible emotional power, like to make these figures which are like kind of crushing, like you feel that they don't eat, you feel they have like this like kind of tiny little sliver of bread which they can eat, and you feel all that. And she was an excellent observer of the truth, so to speak. People had to live through, and in that regard, yeah, I certainly see myself in that type of tradition, and I would be thrilled if I could make, things which have that type of emotional power to it. And what I wanted to say before, by the way, just came back to me, was that, contrary to anything else, painting which has been made over a certain period of time always comes in one piece. It does, for the observer, it comes boom, right? It's in one piece. So, and that is maybe also part of the magic of the whole thing, that you don't need, you need time to view it, but it comes in one piece. It comes in one direct impression onto you. And so that's so different than music or anything else where we have this kind of time continuum where you can never be swallowed up fully in the moment, like painting does, or in a different form, maybe in a different way. But yeah, I'm sure there are also, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, it is true. I think that you do have this condensing particularly with more traditional modes of paint making, where it is something that is planned and very deliberate, and it takes a long time, but you have that contrast between that length of time of a process, a very studied process, and then the immediacy of that one moment of sort of encountering it. So you have the condensing of time into one moment in the experience of work, as opposed to a work that is made along the lines of your work, where it's as if you're having the translation of that moment. It's a moment of experience. It's a moment of making, a moment of experience. And so there's more of a direct link in that transmission between maker and viewer than something that is perhaps a bit more studied, that has embedded within it a much longer period of generation than you're working. Yeah, it's really interesting. All right, I want to turn to another thing that struck me in particular. I want to talk about violence in this series, because for me, we've talked about these, this passage is certainly a struggle in some ways, that there is, an unknown component to whether or not someone is qualified. So the uncertainty, that sort of fear that I think is embedded within that. Are you approaching the gate, and do you have what it takes to sort of move forward into the next state? But there's a real violence that I see, and not just in terms of a sort of natural consequence of a rapid paint application. and the sort of action and the sort of the buildup of the surface, which does lend itself to a certain type of energetic effect, which can read as violent. But in terms of also the forms that your figures take, there is a kind of violence that I feel here. There's a struggle that's going on at the approach to the gate. I mean, I think, you know, here, I mean, the raised arms, this sort of the contrast between the warm and the cool colors. I mean, it definitely gives a sense in which, you know, this is not only not an easy passage to approach, but also something that is very violent. I mean, in this one where it looks as if a figure is being sort of injured and carried away, you know, there's the screams, all of these things give me the sense that not only the difficulty of approaching and possibly moving through the gate or whatever the passageway is to the next space or level, but again, that violence. Can you speak to violence in relationship to this series, or do you not view it that way? Is it just...
No, I think you are pretty accurately state that, and there is violence in there. There's no question about it, and which is violence is part of our experience, of our, you know, like daily experience, basically. I mean, maybe not so not like whatever life-threatening violence, but anything when I want something or I put my will to it has a certain aspect of violence, because I'm doing things, and if I form things, that is, I violate the material. I change things, and I have to have a certain amount of violence, of strength, of energy in order to do this. And then, of course, there is also that transgressional violence, which is like, I want this, and I don't care for the process, and I do not care for the discipline. I just want it, and I go and get it, and no matter what, and it might end up with my demise, but you know, I'm going to do this. So this is certainly an aspect of the entire series, absolutely. And also, you know, also again, this is, you know, like when we speak about painting is, in my view, something which has to do with discipline, or it is a discipline in itself. Like when I talked about the Zen inking and all that, it's the you know, you have to respect that. You know, you have to respect this process, and so it is with technology. I mean, with science. You know, people using these phones and, you know, these mini computers we are using today, and they have no respect for it. They have no respect for what went into this. How many million hours of thinking went into making this, which is like Steve Jobs said so aptly, looks like magic. I mean, the technology comes at that point looking like magic. What we are doing here right now would have been magic like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and so much more like 100 years ago. So, but it leads you also to just take it and not think about it, and, you know, take it as magic, and not respecting it, you know, like, or being even, you know, I don't want to be bothered with the process, I don't want to be bothered with the coding and this and that. Understandable, but, you know, at least see the layer below it, and see, you know, what had to happen in order for this to fall into place, so that we can use it. And it's the same, you know, in any cultural tradition, and in any, and to me, as I said, painting is that type of discipline where you follow a certain, where you have to train in order to be free, you know. So, and that is, I think it's a very big part of it, and violence is an expression of that kind of ignorance and stupidity about this process. You know, there is a certain, that's in there, sure.
So it's, so if you know, one way of looking at these is through that sort of stand-in for the creative process as a whole. The violence is a reflection of, well, what happens when you sort of pull back the curtain on what it means to create successfully. You're sort of laying bare through this sort of violent fissure, this illusion that while it is all seamless, that it isn't a method, that it isn't something that needs to be learned, that it's just instinctual. So there's an element that the violence reflects that as much as it reflects the work of making that transition itself. Does that seem consistent or not quite clear?
Yeah, I mean, I would, as I said, I mean, it's like, it is multi-layered. It's not, yes, it also certainly speaks about the process also, but it's a multi-layered emotion in there. Yeah, absolutely. And it's also multi-layered in terms of its reasons. So when I, like, this is what we're dealing with in these days. I mean, we're dealing with largely ignorant people who are standing on the shoulders of giants and don't even notice that. And we deal with that politically, we deal with that in society. The amount of stupidity we are encountering is like staggering these days. And nobody knows what they're talking about at the same time.
Yeah.
So because nobody goes deep enough to see, the structure, to see the entirety of, the bigger picture, so to speak, and also in terms of time, in terms of relation to the past. Yeah, that's all. Those are things I think about, and they are certainly in there.
Yeah, and it is a in any sense of being able to do that type of thought work, to do the type of sort of, I don't know, the intellectual growth necessary to become aware, to be able to move forward, to engage fully with what is going on in the world from all sides, and to see everything. It is inherently a struggle. It is a violent one within yourself, to be able to kind of reach that state, to be able to be informed, to be able to be a thinking and engaged and aware person. Not a fully formed thought in my head, but it's thinking about the passage that is being illustrated here. Thinking about the tools, this idea from your description of, well, do you have the tools to make this transition point? Part of having those tools is that violent process of self-awareness, self-education, the willingness to be able to open yourself up to uncomfortable truths about how the world works, in whatever facet you're, engaging with it for the purposes of whatever the transition might be, but that it is a sort of violent, sort of ripping apart of your assumptions and the way that you were previously or the way you thought previously. You can't move forward until you have somehow aggressively reckoned with whatever it is that you need to reckon with to kind of become a fully realized individual or engaged individual. So it's interesting. Well, I think that segues to, what we've talked quite a lot about sort of process, but I want to actually switch to more literal forms of violence that sort of come through with these works. And I want to kind of talk a bit about politics, actually. And I know that, in previous correspondence, you have said that these are not political directly in any way, aside from the fact that there was that inspiration moment with the sort of mass migrations that were happening across Europe. The idea that there is a model for within society of people transitioning from one space to another with a barrier. But it's hard for me, perhaps, to not see these through a political lens in some way. I just, things that kept coming up into my mind as I was looking at these This is a shot of Armenian refugees, 1919. These are Holocaust survivors entering Sweden after the war. And then current parallels with the border crisis, with clergy members, praying at the border. And then this is an example from 2015 at the Serbian-Crimean border of refugees trying to get in. And something about not just the composition itself, the figures that emerged, but that violence, right? The violence of displacement, the violence of seeking something new, that sort of mass grouping of all generations who are sort of clawing at the gates, begging to get in, begging to sort of move forward. I can't help but my reference point for it became very clearly political. Do you think that is there maybe even subconsciously some commentary that you feel that you were making, or to you, is it more that you were using the sort of visuals of current events as a structure to explore these other more sort of cerebral rather than more literal or political pursuits or ideas? How do you, it's just very difficult for me to not see these as political in this current moment. So I just curious as your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm an observer, so that's basically, I'm observing myself, I'm observing the world, I'm observing my direct surroundings, and I observe my emotions as well. So, I certainly have ideas about what's happening and what should be happening or what should not be happening. But I don't see them as statements. They are not statements. I don't want to make statements. At the moment, I'm just working on a large painting called Monument to Stupidity, which is the theme is obviously what the theme is. So, but I would like to work it so far that it doesn't have that just simple political statement. I just want to make people aware, or myself aware, of what's happening right now. I see this, I observe it, and I'm just speechless, and I need to do something about it. So that's why I'm doing this. And it's not really, I'm not saying like this is neither pro nor counter refugee or what's. I'm seeing the situation, and I'm seeing it's like completely not controlled. It's not, you can't control it. Apparently, it is costing tons of lives everywhere. And I don't know what needs to be done. I just see this is what's happening. And it like kind of pops into your mind. Obviously, yeah, it's like there's no denying that is the case. But it's not it's not a political statement, in terms of that I would have a recipe or an idea of what needs to be done there. I don't have that. I'm just looking at what's happening. And I find it important enough to, the references are there. Do I build them in consciously? Not really, but I see it. When you point it out, so aptly, I cannot help but not see it, so it's like, yeah.
Do you find in general, in your mind, the more overtly political something would be, do you find that limiting in terms of?
Political art, you mean?
Mm-hmm. Do you find the idea of art that is created with that type of very direct political message?
Yeah, the problem in politics is always limited because it just looks at the world from one certain point of view. Mm-hmm. And I would like to profess to, for myself, to be able to, like in the Kabbalistic sense of viewing, taking a view from every, like when you look at, like for example, you look at reality as the ice surface in Madison Square Garden. That's reality. Okay, so and you have like 18,000 seats, and it looks different from all 18,000 seats. And I would like to look through the eyes of all 18,000 people to see this. So that is I'm sure I'm not capable of doing it, but that is the aim. That's what I want to see. I want to see it from different, from a bird's eye view, from a different standpoint. I am not standing in front of a border and want to get in, but I'm also not standing in front of a border preventing from people getting in. I see both. I see not only both, I see all the other perspectives also. And so to me, that is the only way for an artist to work. I mean, to me, I find it terrible if people take stands and whatever, like limiting themselves to just one tiny, like, yes, if you're an activist, fine, go be an activist, but don't paint that, and don't be that in art. It's like so much bigger, so much greater than that. You can't just, narrow it to such a, and politics is viewpoints. Politics is interest. Certain people have certain interests, and they are fighting to get their interests, acknowledged, and that is what politics is. And so, in that regard, I can see myself being aligned in, like for the elections or whatever, saying, yeah, yes, please vote for this man, but I cannot see myself making a painting which says that.
There's a desire for a sort of universalizing aspect to the effect.
Yeah.
That it would be you as the observer, as someone who is living in the world, the images and structures and ideas could have parallels with direct events that are going on, and that are, a view on that could constitute a political viewpoint, but you're leaving things open for interpretation. So the wider range of reactions and responses could both encompass someone who chooses to see this as a political commentary on a specific event, but it can also be.
Yeah, I'm not averse against that. That's like, of course, that's whatever the viewer, the observer sees and might be reminded on. That's that's it's in the painting or it's in the work, but it doesn't. I don't want it to be such a narrow.
Right. It's not didactic, and it's not.
No.
It's not.
No.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I don't want to tell people what to think or in what direction they should be thinking.
And it comes back to thinking about your process, the idea that it is that coming from that place of personal expressiveness, that sort of the idea of you're realizing the figures as you go through them, and it sort of naturally lends itself to the conclusion. And whether or not on your end you had in your mind something that you've seen, something that you read, just observing sort of on the news or in person, whether that infiltrates the work is more accidental than conscious. Would that be a...
Yeah, I would say so. And also, like it has been a lot of, I don't remember who said that, but it's one of those standard phrases that, the thought of the artist, their own interest, it's like what the artist thought by painting this, it might be anecdotal, of anecdotal interest, but it is not really. The painting needs to stand by itself. It doesn't need the artist's thought. And one of the most terrible examples of that was Kittai, who felt like he had to comment on his own paintings and tell the people what they should be thinking when they see this painting. And it's like, God, it's terrible. It's just, and it's also inconsequential because you have to let them go. And once you're not there anymore, you'll not be able to tell them what it is. So, you have to leave them. Yeah, you can talk about the underlying emotions or underlying whatever, the process, and on and on and on. And that is a very interesting conversation. I cannot give you the user's manual for these paintings.
Yeah. You inherently relinquish control at whatever point you make something.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, once you stop painting them, once you stop working on them, you have to say, okay, these are, I made that. And sometimes I'm really wondering, did I really make this? Because it's like, there's so much distance between you and what you made that it's not, it's not me. I mean, it's like, I'm not injecting myself that it's me, it's me, it's me. It's not me at all. It's like, I was there, but it just happened, but it's not me.
Right.
So.
Yep. It makes a lot of sense, and it's definitely a sort of reflection of the sort of truism of experiencing any sort of work in whatever creative medium once it sort of goes out into the world. You have to sort of relinquish a little bit of control, but you're creating something that needs to stand on its own. If you require an artist or an interpreter basically to be able to access any meaning or depth in a work, then the work itself has sort of failed at its job to a certain degree.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, it should be, to a certain degree, it should be a sort of, self-sufficient is not the right word, but it should be a bit of a, well, the experience of it should be apparent. It should be at the forefront, not the translation of it.
And it also needs to be universally accessible, meaning like, it doesn't matter your level of education, yes, it can enhance your experience, obviously, but it needs to come across also without these references. If you don't have them, you need to at least have that experience when you're standing in front of the basic experience of that thing. You need to have also without knowing what's going on and what has been going on for the last 150 years or 200 years. You need to be able to access that. That is very important, I think. So, yeah.
Absolutely, that's great. Quick little technical question. So what's interesting to me is that this is the only work of the ones that were available at present where you actually, to me, sort of visualize a portal or a gate of some kind. Now, can you just talk just very briefly about the choice to not actually show that gate, with the exception of this work, which appears to show that portal or passageway in some way?
Well, it's like kind of a just it happened also. But when I saw, I had these lines there, the uprights. I just this is Berlin. So this is a very this is the Brandenburger Tor. So this, and it's black, red and white, and it's not a friendly image. So that all, it just suddenly was there, and you could make a point like, oh, this might be a little bit political. So so, but I lived there, so I know what it was like, and so yeah, that's certainly in there. Oh, it's like a reference to violence, to a certain type of violence in a certain country. So it's like with certain colors. So I don't think I have to say more.
No, it's definitely there. It is definitely there. That's interesting. Well, I think for me, those were the series of questions that I had kind of immediately coming out from looking through this series. I think in conclusion, I guess my one big sort of question, which you've answered in many different ways throughout the course of the interview, but if there was, if you had to sort of boil it down, if there was one message or impact that you wanted to come from the experience of seeing this series as a series of these experiences of figures approaching this sort of liminal space of transition, what would you want that conclusion or takeaway to be, if you could sort of summarize it? How do you want people to feel coming out of seeing these works?
Maybe with a more deeper appreciation of reality and all its different aspects, and yeah, maybe more thoughtful, more yeah, I would say be more, coming out of there with a wonderment, like of, oh, this could be looked at that as well. So, and with an open mind, if you want. That would be my, to look at this concept, this idea, which is not an idea, it's not a concept, it's actually reality. This is like happening everywhere. And you just need to see it, and you need to respect what's happening, and to respect what, like what I talked about, the discipline and stuff like that. So you need to, engage with that. And that would be my, that would be great if people came out of this, looking at this, and having taking away some kind of an aspect of that.
Well, thank you. That sounds wonderful to me. So thank you, David, for speaking with me, and for Rachel for setting this up. And that's, I mean, I think this series is just so rich, and there's just so much potential to interpret in so many different ways, which, again, going back to your, the universal potential of experience that you can kind of get from seeing these type of works. It's so open to interpretation, but in a very emotional way. Like these are very emotionally reactive and responsive compositions. So it allows for a full range of interpretation, which I always appreciate when looking at a work, that it doesn't necessarily have a single or didactic point of view. It is something that gives you freedom as a viewer to be able to kind of react, respond, feel, and then put it into whatever framework comes into your own head. Whether it's something that, at least in my case, it went in a very timely or a very quasi-political dimension. That was my first sort of gut of viewing it, but it doesn't preclude those other ideas, the more metaphysical ideas about transition or intellectual ideas. So I really appreciated that about the entirety of the series. So thank you.
Thank you for asking all these great questions. This is like, to me, it's important to talk with some people or with people about things, and it clarifies something for me as well. So while I'm talking with somebody, and you are asking all the great questions, so so that was very important. Very good. All right.